From the Library of Congress in Washington, D.C.
On behalf of Mary Jane and the library, I quickly wanted to take a minute to give my condolences to all Iranians, Iranian women, Persian-speaking audiences in Afghanistan, Tajikistan, and elsewhere for the passing of the poetess Simin Behbahani. It is with a heavy heart that I say this. In the exhibition, we have selected a whole section on women who do Persian poetry and Persian language works from Iran, Afghanistan, and Tajikistan. And Simin is one of the most important poetesses of the current time, the Lioness of Iran, and known as the National Poet of Iran. Dr. Billington and Mary Jane, when they visited Iran in 2004, met with her. She was gracious enough to give her time. And it is a matter of great sadness to us all to see her pass. And with that, I'm going to pass the ground to Dr. Fatemeh Keshavarz and ask her to introduce our lovely speaker. Thank you very much.
Farrokhzhad and I go way back. There has been no particularly important turning point in my life in which she hasn't been involved, whether it was being up for tenure or getting promoted or going from institution to institution to actually reading each other's work and also reading my manuscript and always being a wonderful reader and supporter. So it is with special pleasure that I introduce her. Farrokhzhad did her PhD in comparative literature in University of California in UCLA, and I believe you worked with Amin Banani. I also know you worked closely with many other scholars, including Heshmat Moayyed and others, but I believe that Amin Banani was crucial, and we do indeed miss him. He's been a really important voice in criticism, in particularly poetry criticism. And in her thesis, Farrokhzhad worked on Farrokhzhad from a feminist perspective. So this has been a topic that's been very close to her heart for a long time. She's written, close to 100, if not more, I'm sure, articles and book chapters and op-eds and, just contributions that range from highly specialized and scholarly to things that would appear in New York Times or Washington Post and do that very important job of reaching out to the broader interested public. Her first major book, actually, in English, Veils and Words, was truly, it's a classic. It's about what was that women, poets and writers, their journey within the Persian culture and, from 17th, 18th, 19th century to the present time. And her latest book, which I believe came out in 2011, yes, Words, Not Swords, takes that another step further on what it is that women and women's literature and looking at it from a gendered lens does to understand the role of these voices rather than considering them silent or censored. So that has been a tremendous contribution. I believe you're working on a biography of Forough, so we are eagerly looking forward to that. And with that, I'm just going to invite Farrokhzhad. Please join me in giving her a very warm welcome.
Thank you for taking the time in the middle of a beautiful Wednesday to come and hear about Farrokhzhad and to listen to me. You honor me with your presence. Thank you again. I'm humbled to talk in the presence of some giants in the field of modern literature. I have my colleague, Ahmad Karimi Hakak, for whose work I have great admiration, and I've written about it. So it's not only now that I say it. And of course, my dear friend Fatemeh Keshavarz, from whom I have learned a great deal, and the rest of you for being here. With your permission, I would like to start with a short tribute to a woman I loved like a mother, to a poet I admired greatly. I think Iran and all of us Iranians have lost an enlightened voice of conscience, an elegant voice of moderation, an audacious voice of dissent. I really think she's irreplaceable. And there aren't too many things in the world that I think are irreplaceable, but Simin Behbahani is irreplaceable. I hope her words and her advocacy for nonviolence, which is central to her work, will spread to the four corners of this troubled world we live in. Well, surely, even though our government didn't announce much the passing of this giant of Persian literature, you saw how the people of Iran paid tribute to their poets. In fact, they sang her poems, and these were her own words, put to music by one of our best singers, Humayun Shajarian. And you saw him, it was at the funeral, crying. Well, let's switch now to Farrokhzhad. I will tell you a little bit about my involvement with Forough later on, but let me tell you what I plan to do today. As Fatemeh Jan mentioned, I've been working on Farrokhzhad for 37 years, and I'm finally finishing her biography. So it was really hard to condense it in 45 minutes, in 50 minutes. So I had to make a certain decision. So I'm going to focus first and foremost on the biography of this iconoclastic icon. It's amazing that this woman who chose the pen name iconoclastic, Botchekan, has herself become a bot, an icon. But because there is so little information about the first part of her life, and we know a lot more about the last 8-10 years of your life. In my talk, I will focus on that part, and I think most of that information has not been available. And then in the Q&A, I will be honored to answer any question if you have about the second part of her life. I want to tell you a little bit about the trials and tribulations of writing a biography in Iran, of writing a woman's biography in Iran, and in particular, of writing Forough Farrokhzad's biography. I believe she's the most talked about woman, Iranian woman. I Googled her about a month ago. I was going to do it last night. I didn't get a chance to be up to date. But a month ago, if you do a Scholar Google, Forough Farrokhzad has about twice as many hits as Mohammad Reza Shah Pahlavi, who ruled Iran for 37 years. So it would be fair to say that she has become quite popular and she's talked about. And finally, I would like to share with you some of her unpublished letters that I have collected over the last 37 years, and that it had taken me so long to finally decide that maybe I'm not invading her privacy to publish them. I have been in possession of some of these letters, not all of them, for a long time. But because they were so personal, I wasn't sure it's the right thing to publish them. But given the fact that there is so much misinformation about her, and there is the fact that it's almost a quarter of a century, half a century after her death, I thought maybe it would be the right thing to publish these about 100 pages of unpublished letters, along with the biography. So a little bit about Farrokhzad's early life. You have probably as her birthday in January of 1935. It's not the right birthday. There's so many misinformation about her. And I'm not sure I can figure out why, but they're out there. I have seen her birth certificate. So with certainty, I can tell you that she was born on Saturday, the 29th of December, 1934. She was born to Turan Vaziri Tabar and Mohammad Farrokhzhad Araki. You will see, again, in Farrokhzad's document, her name is Farrokhzhad Farrokhzhad Araki. That's her birth certificate. And I will get to why Araki, where does that come from? The child was born Farrokhzhad, which significantly means eternal light. And of course, the occasion of the birth of a child is always a jubilant occasion. And hers was too, except that it was marred by the absence of the father. Lieutenant Mohammad Farrokhzhad at the time was in prison. And he was the head of Pahlavi royal properties, Raise Amlak Saltanati Noshahr. And for some reason, he and a few others had been put in prison. So when Forough was born, he was not there to welcome his daughter, who was his third child. So Mr. Farrokhzhad was released from prison after a year, And like the paradoxical country that Iran is, after a year of imprisonment, he returned to his position in Nowshar as the head of the Pahlavi property. So Farrokhzhad was born in Tehran, but he spent the first 6 years of his life not in Tehran, but in Nowshar, which is the northern part of Tehran in the province of Mazandaran. They lived in a beautiful big house, in fact, in front of the castle of Reza Shah Pahlavi. On one side was a forest, on the other side was the Caspian Sea. And Forough loved the forest, and apparently she was constantly running to the forest. What we might not know, and I didn't know for a while, is that Forough was stunningly beautiful as a baby, as a girl. She had fair complexion, big black eyes, and curly hair, blonde curly hair. Kind of unusual for Iran. And lovingly, and I would say ironically, she was called Arusak Farangi. Now I say ironically because this little girl was anything but a doll. She refused to be commandeered by strings like a marionette. Throughout her life, and beginning from her very early childhood, the prospect of becoming a puppet horrified her. She had a will of her own. She was willful, determined, tenacious. I will tell you, I have interviewed over 60 people, her family members, her close friends, and some of her colleagues. And most of the information I give you today are things that I have cross-referenced. I've heard some things, if they were not cross-referenced, I've tried to avoid saying them. But almost many people who knew her as a child told me that, first of all, when they were in Nowshar, she preferred the forest. And when they moved to Tehran, when she was 6 years old, she preferred the street. She was constantly fighting boys and often gave them a good beating. She scaled walls. I've heard from a couple of people that she was like مثل گربه رو هره را میرفت, agile like a cat. Really nimble with gravity-defying agility. She jumped, she climbed trees. This is not image of a young girl in Iran of the 30s. She was fearless and daring. And these words basically didn't exist in her lexicon. A little bit about Forough's parents, because they, in their own right, are really fascinating people, and we don't hear about them. In particular, we rarely ever hear about the mother, who was a fascinating woman. She too was a subversive woman. She was born in 1913. She was unveiled before the Unveiling Act of 1936. She went to the American school in Tehran. She was not yet 16 when, at a party in the house of a relative, she met this young lieutenant, Mohammad Farrokhzhad, who was 11 years older. And she fell in love with him, and he fell in love with her. Turan had lost her father before she was even born. The mother, Zahra Khanum, lovely mother, and Forough, in fact, has a few references to her grandmother in her poetry. And the more I've learned about Zahra Khanum, the more I have come to appreciate those lines about the grandmother in Forough's poetry. Both of them were very opposed to this wedding. But she was adamant. She wanted to marry him, and they did. Turan was a very hardworking woman. Everybody talks about her proclivity for outspoken simplicity and honesty. She had a hard time lying, as her daughter will later. I think one of the most beautiful characteristics of Farrokhzhad is her incapacity to lie. I'm not saying she never lied. Such a person probably doesn't exist. But in a culture of walls and veils and masks and masquerades, Farrokhzhad was herself as much as it was possible to be. Once she was chosen as the Mother of the Year. This is her. This is before the age of 24. She had already 4 children. And by the age of 35, she had 7 children. And she had a few pregnancies that did not go to full term. Now, what about the father? Let me tell you one other thing that I find so fascinating about Turan Farrokhzhad. She was a doll collector. And because dolls are so central, again, in Forough's life and in Forough's poetry, one of her most beautiful poems is Arusak Kuki. Mitavan hamchon arusak hay kuki bud. One can be a poet. One can be like a doll and just say, oh, yes, I'm so very lucky all the time, and be full of pretenses all the time. And she didn't like that. Turan Farrokhzhad was a doll collector. And in her, she wanted to be buried with her favorite dolls. And unfortunately, due to the laws of the land, she was not granted this last wish of hers. I have seen some of her dolls, and when they told me the story, it made me really sad that they wouldn't even allow her to do that. But her dolls were very important in her life. You know, you would think after 7 children, yes. Now, just a little bit about the father, Mohammad Farrokhzhad Araki. He was a self-made man. His last name actually was Rezai. And when he was in prison earlier, he had had a few experiences in prison. He was reading Persian literature, poetry. He loved Persian poetry. And he came across the word Farrokhzhad and loved it. So he decided to change his last name. So he changed it from Rezai to Farrokhzhad. And because he was from Tafresh, in northern Iran. And at the time, in pre-Islamic Iran, Tafresh was called Iraq. Some called it Iraq Ajam. And then later on, it was called Iraq. So you see in legal documents, and I've seen lots of, at the beginning, I would see all these documents about Farrokhzhad, Farrokhzhad Farrokhzhad Araki. I said, what is this Araki coming from? So that's where it comes from. And later on, of course, it was deleted, and rarely anybody knows them as Farrokhzhad Araki. But all their documents, and I have seen many of them, the father, the mother, in all of them, it's Araki. They have that. So he was 14 when he was going to marry the widowed sister-in-law. According to the customs of Tafresh, the brother had passed away, and he was to marry the wife, the widowed wife. So the day of the wedding, he decided to flee, to leave Tafresh and to go to Tehran. He did so. He went to Tehran with very little cash, but an abundant supply of energy and audacious. She was a very adventurous man. Audacious is the right word. He joined Reza Khan. At the time, Reza Shah was not Reza Shah yet. He joined Reza Khan's Cossack brigade. And then when Reza Khan became Reza Shah, soon he sent him to Nowshahar as the head of his properties. That's how they ended in Nowshahar. Purandukht, the first the first daughter was born in Nowshahar, actually. Around the abdication time of Reza Shah, the family moved back to Tehran. He joined the gendarmerie, and he changed a few jobs, and then around the revolution, he retired. He stayed home, and he died in 1992 at the age of 90. Now, what about Forough? So at the age of 6, they come back to Tehran. She first goes to Jaleh kindergarten, and then to Soroush educational elementary school, which is a co-educational school. It's interesting at the time. There weren't too many co-educational schools, but that was a co-educational school in their neighborhood, in Amiriyeh. That's where they lived. Then she goes to Khosrow Khavar, and eventually she decides to go to a technical school for her high school, because she was interested in painting and sewing. Before finishing high school, she fell madly in love with a neighbor, literally door-to-door neighbor, who happened to also be a distant relative, a distant cousin of her mother. His name was Parviz Shahpur. The parents were adamantly opposed to the marriage, but Forough attempted her first suicide at that tender age. She was absolutely adamant that that's the man she wants to marry. Eventually, on September 14, 1950, they got married. 3-4 months earlier, the sister Puran had also been married in the same house. Forough's marriage, from all accounts, was quite different. It was very simple. There are absolutely no pictures of that wedding because they wanted to save money. They didn't want that. That was not an extravagant wedding. It was only for tea and sweets, which usually is unusual in Iran. The bride did not have her own gown. She borrowed the gown of her sister. She borrowed the ring, the emerald ring of her sister. Even the mirror and the candle holders belonged to Puran. So this is one of the earliest pictures that we have available of the bride and the groom. Just to tell you a little bit about the groom, Parviz Shahpur, who was also significantly 11 years older than Farrokhzhad, exactly like the age difference between the father and the mother. And throughout her life, Farrokhzhad was consistently more interested in men who were older. 11, Mr. Golestan is even older. I will talk in a minute about Nasser Khodayar. He was even older. So she was interested in older men. Shapur was born in 1923. He graduated from Tehran University. His field was economics. And he was working at the time of the wedding in the Ministry of Finance in Tehran. Soon after the wedding, the couple moved to Khuzestan, which is southern part of Iran. Parviz Shapur was an artist. He was what Shamlu called kari kalamaturist, which is a fusion of caricature, bare-bone drawings, and dexterity with words. In fact, many people have told me one of the main reasons Forough fell in love with him was because he was so wonderful with words. And if you read his books and his karikalomatur, you see that it's with perfect economy. And he really says a lot in those. He was working for Tawfiq magazine for a while, and his drawings were exhibited in Tehran twice, that I know, and recently even in New York. So, he was an artist in his own right. Usually, many of the people who have lived around Farrokhzhad have been overshadowed by her iconic status. And I think Parviz Shapur is one of them. Their son, Kamyar, was born a year and a half after their wedding, on June 19, 1952. The mother was still a teenage mother. And he was around 2 years old when Forough published her first, this is Forough before she had a nose surgery, and when she was still in Ahvaz. This is early Farrokhzhad. This is one of my most precious pictures. This is after Kamyar was born. The man in this corner is Parviz Shapur, and the first woman on the right is Farrokhzhad. And this is Forough with Kamyar. Kamyar was about 2. So when Kamyar was about 2 years old, his mother started publishing poems. She was she wanted to publish in magazines, as it was customary at the time. You start in magazines and journals, and then you graduate to your own collections. So you might have heard that one day she went to the office of Roshan Fikr, which at the time was one of Iran's most popular magazines. We're talking about early 50s. Feridun Moshiri, the poet, was the person in charge of the literary page. And he had never met her. And unannounced, she knocks at the door and enters the room of Mr. Moshiri. And she's very nervous. Mr. Moshiri told us before he passed away. And Mr. Moshiri was also one of our major literary figures and a very kind person. She's kind of shy and shivering, and Her fingers are ink-stained. And in her early life, Forough always wrote with ink that was green. Green ink was the ink she always used. So it was green. And so Moshiri didn't know what she wanted. And she handed 3 poems to Moshiri and said that she would like him to publish these poems. Now, please consider the audacity of a woman who is barely 20, who goes unannounced, unknown, to the office of a magazine, finds her way to the office of the editor-in-chief of the literary section. Moshiri looks at the poems, and the first one he sees is called Sin, Gonah. It's a beautiful poem, a short poem, 12-line poems. گناه کردم گناهی پر ز لذت در آغوشی که گرم و آتشین بود. I sinned voluptuously in the arms of a man that was fiery, and it goes on and on. It's a reversal of 1,000 years of Persian literature. It was always men who talked about their love for a woman or a feminized lover. And here was this woman singing her love for a man. It was quite clear that it was a woman writing for a man. And Moshiri was quite taken. She said she has 2 others, and Mr. Moshiri told her, I would need to consult with my editors. He said he was concerned about the safety of the magazine, about the reaction of the people. And he consulted the editorial board, and most of them wanted the poem to be published. They thought it's a good poem, it's interesting, it's a novelty. One person, Mr. Nasser Khodayar, the editor-in-chief, was the most adamant. He said, "Aqa chap kon bere." Of course, just publish it. I don't know, that was not a good translation. It's "Aqa chap kon bere" is such a... How would you translate that? Sure, let's do it. Let's do it and get it over with. Exactly, yes. So, as Moshiri said, ما چاپ کردیم و نرفت. We published it, but it didn't go well. Because although some people loved the poem, there were a lot of people who were totally shocked and aggravated by this poem. Love poems, adulterous relationship, are dime a dozen in Persian literature. We have plenty of adulterous women in Persian literature. So what was about this poem that became so scandalous, that brought Forough immediately to a level of notoriety, of scandal, that was unheard of before her? What was in this poem that shocked and titillated the readers? Because it really did titillate a lot of people too. I have a few suggestions, and I'm sure there are plenty more. This woman calls herself a sinner. The poem is called Sin, and she begins with I, which is very unusual, an autobiographical statement for a woman in a culture where autobiographical statements and life narratives are not quite allowed. At least they were not allowed. Now everybody is writing a memoir, and my aunt too. But back then it wasn't like that. We didn't have biographies or autobiographies by women. So the poem starts with I, I sinned. But more importantly, she has sinned, but she's not repentful. In fact, throughout the poem, she's quite exhilarated. Something mysterious has happened to her. The poem is about the awakening of a woman to sexuality, to the joy of physical union. She's never experienced it before, and she has this time, and she's writing about it. So she's talking about a taboo topic, but she's also talking about freedom of expression. I committed a sin, yes, it is a sin, but eat your heart out, I'm not repentful, and I'm going to tell you all about it. More importantly, this adulterous woman, unlike the slew of adulterous women in Persian literature, does not undergo a religious awakening. She's not taken to the right path through marriage. She does not blame the man, which is admirable in the poem. She takes full responsibility for her acts. Unlike most adulterous women, and conveniently, she does not commit suicide. She does not kill herself. And she's not killed by some mysterious disease either. She stays alive, and she's well, and she's going to go on. So, but I think even more important than all of these things was the layout of that first poem. Look at it. So this whole piece, most of it is about her picture. I mean, there are two pictures and a biographical sketch. And if you read the biographical sketch, it's all about the fact that this is a married woman. She has a child who is 2 years old. She has beautiful disheveled hair. She has beautiful black eyes that are penetrating. So the focus is on her body and on her marital status. So in other words, whoever wrote that early piece wanted to make sure that this woman committed this pleasurable act of union with a man who is not her husband. The layout of the magazine turns a poem into a testimonial of sorts. It's almost like a report. At the time, many of Iranian poets had chosen pseudonyms. Farrokhzhad could have done the same. In fact, she did use pseudonyms, pen names, later for some of her prose writing. Two very interesting pen names, Bochekan, the iconoclast, and Farrokhzhad, born of fairies, that I know of. There might be others that I'm not still aware of. Forough found herself at the eye of a gathering storm. The father, Mr. Farrokhzhad, was furious with the publication of this sin, and of course the husband was as well. I have heard that when this poem was published, and I don't say that with joy, my heart goes to him. Mr. Shapur, Parviz Shapur, the husband, did not leave home for a whole week. He just could not face the world. And you understand, in a culture where honor of a man depends on the sexual acts of a woman, And to me, that's a prison, but it is nonetheless how it is, how it was back then, and how it is to a certain extent today. This is Nasser Khudayar. Not much usually is known about him, which is interesting. I will tell you, he's the man for whom Sin was published. He is the beloved of Sin. And I'm not intruding upon Faroukh's privacy. In a minute, you will see that at a time in the 50s, it became the talk of town in Tehran. It's often mentioned that Farrokhzhad published her first poetry collection when she was 17. I have not come across any such poems or poetry collection. Her first collection is called Captive, Asir, the Captive, and it was published in 1334, 1955. Most of the poems in Asir are, in fact, written in 1953 and 1954. So I don't know how she could have published Asir when she was 17. So I think that's a false statement. Asir was by itself a novelty. For the first time in Iranian literary history, a woman from a non-literary family was publishing a collection of poems. Prior to her, none of the poems, none of the poetry collections by our women writers have been published by people who were not in literary families. Simin Daneshvar, Simin Behbahani, Lobat Vala, Parvin Dolatabadi, and the list goes on and on. Significantly, the poem Sin, which brought Forough to fame and notoriety, was excised from Asir. And apparently the relationship with Khudayar had gone sour. So soon, Asir became a highly acclaimed poem because it was unusual poetry. It had 44 poems, and it had an introduction by Shuja'eddin Shafa. So I asked Mr. Shafa, I said, how did you end up writing this introduction to Asir? Again, the story is so important if you want to put it in the context of the difficulties women confronted in becoming writers or poets in Iran of the time. So apparently the publisher had told Forough that in order for her poetry collection to be published, they would want her to have a major writer write an introduction to the collection. So one afternoon, as Mr. Shafa told me, that there was a knock at the door. He goes to open the door, and there is a young woman there with a book in her hand, and she introduces herself, and Mr. Shafa immediately recognizes him, because at the time, many people, definitely people in literature, knew of Farrokhzhad, the poet of Sin. And she's invited in, and she tells him, I'm here because I want you to write an introduction to my book. That's the reason. The publisher wants you to do that. Would you consider doing it? And Shafa says, of course, I will do it. So that's how Shafa wrote the introduction. So Asir was published without Sin, but significantly also without an afterword that Forough had written to it. And that afterword, if you have not read it, may I suggest you read it. It's called Tozih. it is really a manifesto of Forough Farrokhzhad. I don't know why it was excised, and I don't know why it's not reprinted anywhere. I will be happy to send you a copy of it if anybody is interested in it. I think we should all read what a barely 20-year-old woman wrote about poetry and about women's lives in Iran at the time. In Asir, and then later in Divar, Osyan, and Tavalludi Digar, Walls, Rebellion, and Reborn, the other 4 collections. These are the 4 collections that Forough published during her lifetime. There are a few central themes that are central to her life. So I'm going to quickly try to just enumerate them. First, of course, is motherhood. Farrokhzhad was a teenage mother. And in the letters that you will see published in the biography that hopefully will be published soon, the pain of being separated from her son and the love that she had for her son is really central, not only to her poetry, but also to all the letters, to many of the letters. In effect, because she chose poetry as a vocation, as a profession, she was denied her right of motherhood. Fatherhood in Iran is a granted phenomenon. All you have to do is to contribute physically to the act of conception. A mother becomes a mother with birth of a child, but to remain a mother, she has to earn that. Motherhood is not a right for Iranian women. Motherhood is a privilege. And because Forough Farrokhzhad divorced her husband, and because she chose to be as she called it, she constantly said it in the letters, in the poems, I want to become a great poet. She said that since she was 19. So I want to become a great poet, and I can't reconcile that with the life of domesticity and raising children. But that didn't mean that she didn't want to have her instinct as a mother denied. So that caused her great pain, and as many of you know, after Mr. Khodayar decided to publish the detail of her relationship with Farrokhzhad in a serial called Shukufei Kabud, she was considered a promiscuous woman now, not only by her own admission, but also by the admission of the lover. So not only she was divorced, she was denied custodial rights of her son, and eventually visitation rights with her son. That pain remained with her for the rest of her life. It's interesting to note that before The Feminine Mystique was published in the US, and before Of Women Born of Adrienne Rich was published in the US, Forough Farrokhzhad had talked about both those issues in her poetry. In particular, her first 3 poetry collections, which for some reason is not considered due recognition in Iran. Everybody talks about Reborn, and nobody talks about those 3 first poems, which are the pain of a woman who is trying to break free from these molds that are imprisoning her. Again, it's not that she didn't want to be a mother. She wanted to reconcile it with being an artist. And that right was not granted to her. This is a picture with Simin Behbahani. So after the publication of Shukufei Kabud, Forough attempted another suicide. She was taken to psychiatric hospital, Rezai, She was hospitalized, institutionalized for a month. She was given electric shock therapy. And when she left, this is a picture soon after it, she decided to leave Iran. She left Iran on a cargo plane. And in some of the letters that you will read in the published letters, you see how she has to scramble to get the money to go to Europe. She wanted to study. She went to Italy, and then she went to Germany. She worked while she was in Italy. She did some dubbing, she did some sewing. And after 16 months, she decided to return. She needed Iran, and she needed the language and the people. She went back to Iran, and of course, not having high education, it was hard to find a job. So she was introduced to Golestan Film Studio. Mr. Golestan, a pioneer of Iranian cinema and Iranian literature, hired her as a filing clerk. So she started her position there to be economically independent and to finally have a room of her own. She started working there. Soon afterwards, a very passionate, lustful, loving relationship developed between the two. And for the last 8 years of her life, Farrokhzhad had a very intense relationship with Golestan. As you know, her fourth poetry collection is dedicated to E.G. Ebrahim Golestan. And some of the poems in Tavalludi Digar, I believe, are the most beautiful poems a woman has ever written about a man. I often tell Mr. Golestan, I think he's the Prince Charming of Persian literature. No man, to the best of my knowledge, has been loved and adulated the way Mr. Golestan has been in Persian literature, in Forough's poetry. Forough started traveling. Mr. Golestan recognized that she is highly talented. She showed interest in film, and in 1962, she was sent to a leprosarium, Baba Baghi leprosarium, in which she made a movie. I assume most of you have seen it. If not, please allow me to recommend you watch that film. It's a 22-minute documentary. It has been considered by many, Iranian and Western, film critics as one of the best 10 documentaries made in the world. And this young woman in her 20s, with minimal possibilities and resources, made this amazing movie. My introduction to Forough Farrokhzhad was actually through that film. I vividly recall the first time I saw that film. Images of disfigured patients of leprosy. It was a summer day in Tehran, the smell of jasmine everywhere. And I remember what I was wearing, where I was sitting, and suddenly I saw these images on the screen of the television. I could neither look at these images nor could I take my eyes off. It was the most powerful visual poetry I've ever seen. Since then, Forough Farrokhzhad became my companion. Her poetry became my garden, my home. Every time I go to it, it's welcoming. I smell my childhood. I regain the lost time. It's beautiful poetry, and it has a special meaning for me. So I came to this country in 1967, December of 1967. I wanted to do my dissertation. My major was French literature, and I was going to write my dissertation on Flaubert and his search for the ideal woman and the perfect words. And my argument was that neither will be possible because they don't exist, and unless you change your perspective. And but soon, thanks to Dr. Banani, my teacher and my mentor, I switched major again, and I decided to write my dissertation on Forough. But I was going to write my dissertation on her biography. So that's in the 70s. I went to Iran repeatedly for my research. And soon I realized that writing her biography was impossible. To give you quickly the reasons why, many men were all too eager to share with me their love affair with Farrokhzhad. I was not interested in that. Those who knew the most will tell me, what's the point of talking about a dead person? Many people made fun of me. So in America, they give a PhD for a woman who barely got her high school diploma, and on and on. And I have often told Mr. Golestan, so I can tell you that. And when I finally met Mr. Golestan and started asking him about Farrokhzhad, he looked at me, he said, Miss Milani, I have heard you are a good cook. And I thought he's trying to compliment me, the idiot that I was. And I said, who told you? He said, your teacher, Banani tells me you're a good cook. And Mr. Banani was a chef. Well, I said, if he says it, maybe I'm not a bad cook. I was still clueless. He said, I have a suggestion for you. Why don't you write a cookbook? That was the end of my biographical enterprise. But I promised myself I will keep working at it, and I have for 37 years. It has been a while, but I have finally almost done it. And I want to quickly tell you and finish where I got, after all these years of agony and not knowing what to do, where I found my model and how I'm trying to do this biography. The film, The House is Black, is the biography of a leprosarium. At least that's how I see it. It's about the life of patients in a leprosarium, a colony where lepers were ostracized and literally imprisoned. The way she tells the truth, the way she doesn't sugarcoat anything, the way she does not invade privacy, the way she's devoted to imparting truth as she saw it, without judging, without moralizing, was a lesson to me. This is a tall order for any biographer, and I'm not sure I will succeed. But I can tell you with certainty that it has been my model. I would like to be revealing but not voyeuristic. I would like to be candid but not judgmental. I would like to be informative but respectful of someone who suffered all her life because her privacy was not respected. So that's also the reason that I have been sitting on some of these letters for decades, because those letters were not addressed to all of us. Those letters were addressed to one person. And I was not sure, even though the people that I had come into contact, the people I had interviewed, were kind enough, generous enough to give me those letters. And I knew I have to share it with people, but I wasn't sure I'm not invading her privacy. So finally, after seeing that film, and after seeing what she has done to leprosy, which is a disease that we always covered up, I said, no, she now belongs to Iranian literature. She now belongs to Iran. And after 50 years, after so many misinformation and so much information and misinformation on her, we need to hear her own voice. So these are pictures of the son she adopted at the leprosarium. She came back with this son, Hossein Mansouri, and again, she's, to the best of my knowledge, the first woman who began this idea of single parenthood and adopting a child. These are precious pictures that I don't think you've ever seen before of Forough at the leprosarium. And finally, just to give you an idea of the published letters, and altogether, Forough has published a little less than 80 letters, have been published so far. Most of them were published, 56 letters, 55 to Parviz Shahpur and 1 to his mother, so a total of 56, in a collection, Avalin Tapeshhay Qalb Man, the first throb of my loving heart for her husband. It is a very interesting, a fascinating book, and just a few other short poems. All of these letters have been censored in a way. There are words missing, a sentence missing, a paragraph missing. I have chosen not to do that. Not a single word will be deleted from the 30 letters, and I'm going to have her own handwriting side by side with the transcribed version of it, so that you can read for yourself. As you see, the letter spanned from her early teenage years to the last 15 letters she wrote from Europe to Mesogolestan. And I think they're very important literary documents. Thank you very much for listening.
This has been a presentation of the Library of Congress. Visit us at loc.gov.